Dad, you're going to prison.
Malcolm, stay out of this.
No. 20 years ago, you saved my life. Today, I'm your lawyer, and I'm going to expose who framed you.
It was just after midnight when 10-year-old Malcolm sat alone beneath a concrete bridge on the edge of downtown. Rainwater ran along the pavement beside him, and every few minutes, cars passed overhead, shaking the bridge and making the ground tremble beneath his thin blanket. Malcolm pulled his knees close to his chest and tried to stay warm. His old backpack was tucked under his head like a pillow, even though there was almost nothing inside it. A broken pencil, a small notebook, and a picture of his mother were all he had left. He had learned not to cry when he was hungry. He had learned not to ask strangers for help. Most of all, he had learned that promises didn't mean much when you had nobody to keep them. Earlier that evening, he had watched families walk into restaurants, laughing and carrying bags of food, while he searched a nearby trash can for something he could eat. He wasn't looking for money anymore. He just wanted to make it through another night. Then a black luxury sedan slowly pulled up near the bridge. Malcolm immediately sat up. He had seen expensive cars before, but this one was different. Two men in dark suits stepped out first and looked around before opening the back door. A Korean man in his late 40s stepped out. His name was Kang Min-yi, although Malcolm didn't know that yet. To most people in the city, Min-yi was a powerful businessman with a reputation that made people careful around him. He was the kind of man nobody approached unless they had a good reason. But that night something made him stop. His eyes landed on the boy sitting beneath the bridge. Min-yi stared for a few seconds before walking closer. "What's your name?" he asked. Malcolm didn't answer. He tightened his grip on his backpack and looked away. Min-yi tried again. "I'm not here to hurt you." Malcolm finally looked up and quietly said, "Malcolm." Min-yi noticed the boy's wet clothes, the dirt on his shoes, and the way he kept watching the road as if he expected someone to come back for him. "Where are your parents?" he asked. Malcolm's eyes dropped to the ground. After a long silence, he whispered, "I don't have anyone." Those 5 words stayed with Min-yi. He had heard thousands of excuses and lies in his life, but this boy wasn't trying to get anything from him. He wasn't begging, he wasn't even asking for help. He had simply accepted that nobody was coming. Min-yi looked at his driver and said, "Get him some food." Malcolm shook his head at first, afraid there was a catch, but Min-yi simply stood there and waited. For the first time in a long time, Malcolm wondered if someone had actually stopped because they cared. Kang Min-yi was not the kind of man people asked questions about. In his world, people lowered their voices when his name came up, and even powerful businessmen thought twice before standing against him. But Malcolm knew none of that. To him, Min-yi was simply the strange man who had stopped beneath a bridge on a rainy night and asked if he was hungry. When Min-yi told his driver to bring food, Malcolm stayed where he was, watching carefully. He had learned the hard way that free things usually came with a price. A few minutes later, the driver returned with hot food, bottled water, and a clean jacket. Malcolm stared at the meal for several seconds before finally reaching for it. He ate slowly at first, then faster when his hunger took over. Min-yi didn't say anything, he just stood nearby and watched. When Malcolm finished, Min-yi asked, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Malcolm pointed toward the bridge. Min-yi looked at the cold concrete and then back at the boy. "Not tonight," he said, "you're coming with me." Malcolm immediately shook his head. "I don't know you." Min-yi almost smiled. "That's fair." He crouched down so they were at the same level. "Then don't trust me yet, just come somewhere warm." Those words were different from what Malcolm had heard before. Nobody was demanding that he trust them. Nobody was promising him a perfect life. For the first time, someone was simply giving him a choice. Malcolm climbed into the car. As they drove through the city, he kept his backpack on his lap and stared out the window. He had no idea that the man sitting across from him owned several businesses, had enemies in powerful places, and was feared by men who carried guns. He only noticed that Min-yi kept looking at him, as if he was trying to understand how a child could end up alone on the streets. At Min-yi's large home, Malcolm froze at the front door. He had never seen anything like it. One of the guards tried to take his backpack, but Malcolm pulled it away. Min-yi immediately stopped him. "Leave it," he said, "that's his." Inside, Malcolm was given a warm shower, clean clothes, and a real bed. He kept asking when he had to leave. Min-yi finally looked at him and said, "You don't." The next morning, Min-yi made a decision that shocked everyone around him. His closest men warned him, "Boss, bringing this boy into your life is dangerous." Min-yi looked across the room at Malcolm eating breakfast alone. Then he answered quietly, "Maybe, but leaving him out there is worse." Nobody argued after that. Within weeks, Min-yi began the legal process to adopt Malcolm. He didn't do it for publicity, money, or sympathy. He did it because somewhere along the way, the powerful man who had everything realized there was one thing money could never buy: a second chance to become someone's family. The first few weeks were harder than Minyi expected. Malcolm had a safe house, warm meals, clean clothes, and a comfortable bed, but he still acted like he was waiting to be thrown out. Every morning he folded his blanket perfectly and kept his backpack packed beside the bed. He never left food on his plate because he remembered too many nights when there had been nothing to eat. If someone walked into the room too quickly, he would immediately become quiet. Minyi noticed all of it, but he didn't force Malcolm to talk. He understood that you couldn't erase years of fear with a nice house and a full refrigerator. Instead, he gave the boy something Malcolm had never really had before: time. He enrolled him in a good school and personally made sure he had everything he needed. At first, Malcolm hated school. Some kids stared at him because he was the new black boy living with a wealthy Korean family. Others asked questions he didn't know how to answer. "Are you really his son?" one boy asked during lunch. Malcolm didn't know what to say. He went home that afternoon and asked Minyi, "Am I?" Minyi looked at him for a moment before answering, "If you want to be." That simple answer stayed with Malcolm. Minyi never demanded that Malcolm call him dad. He never tried to replace the mother Malcolm had lost. He simply showed up. He attended parent meetings, helped with homework when he could, and learned Malcolm's favorite foods. He even tried playing basketball with him one Saturday afternoon and nearly fell trying to copy Malcolm's moves. For the first time, Malcolm laughed without checking who was watching. Slowly, the walls between them started coming down. Malcolm began leaving his backpack in his room instead of carrying it everywhere. He stopped hiding food. He started talking about school, his dreams, and the things he remembered about his mother. One night while they were eating dinner, Malcolm suddenly looked across the table and said, "Can I call you Dad?" Minyi froze. The powerful man who had faced dangerous enemies without fear suddenly didn't know what to say. He lowered his eyes for a second, then smiled and replied, "I'd like that." From that night on, things changed. Malcolm no longer felt like a guest in the house. He felt like family. But there was another side to Minyi's life that Malcolm was slowly beginning to notice. Men came to the house late at night. Security guards were always nearby. Phone calls stopped whenever Malcolm entered the room. One evening, Malcolm asked, "Dad, what do you really do?" Minyi didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the boy he had rescued years earlier and realized that one day Malcolm would need to know the truth. But before that day came, Minyi wanted to give his son one thing his own world had never given him: a chance to choose a different life. For years, Malcolm believed his father was simply a wealthy businessman who traveled often and had more security than most people needed. But as Malcolm grew older, the questions became harder to ignore. Why did armed men guard the house? Why did certain visitors wait outside until Minyi gave permission? And why did conversations suddenly stop whenever Malcolm entered the room? One night, when Malcolm was 16, he finally got an answer. He had come downstairs looking for a glass of water when he heard voices coming from Minyi's private office. The door was slightly open and Malcolm heard a man say, "The shipment is ready, but the rival group is making trouble again." Malcolm stopped walking. He had never heard his father talk about business like that. Then another voice said, "If they keep pushing, we may have to respond." Malcolm quietly stepped away before anyone saw him. The next morning, he confronted Minyi at breakfast. "Dad, what kind of business are you really running?" Minyi put down his coffee and stayed silent for several seconds. He knew this moment would eventually come. Finally, he told Malcolm the truth. His businesses were real, but they were only one part of a much larger operation. For years, Minyi had controlled a powerful criminal network involved in illegal gambling, underground money transfers, smuggling, and protection. Men feared him because he had built an empire where loyalty mattered more than the law. Malcolm was stunned. "So you're a criminal?" he asked. Minyi didn't defend himself. "Yes," he said quietly, "I've done things I'm not proud of." Malcolm stood up, angry and confused. He remembered the man under the bridge who had saved him, the father who had helped him with homework, the man who had stayed beside him when he was sick. How could that same person be involved in a world like this? Minyi didn't ask Malcolm to forgive him. Instead, he said something Malcolm would never forget. "I can give you money, I can give you a house, I can give you anything this world can buy, but I cannot give you back the years I wasted becoming this man." Malcolm asked why he had adopted him if his life was so dangerous. Minyi looked him directly in the eyes. "Because when I saw you under that bridge, I saw a child who deserved a choice. I didn't want you to become me." From that day forward, Minyi kept Malcolm even further away from his criminal world. He encouraged him to study, travel, and build a future of his own. Malcolm became fascinated with the law. He wanted to understand how evidence worked, how criminals were prosecuted, and how innocent people could be protected. One evening, Minyi watched him studying a thick law book and smiled. "Become a lawyer," he told him. Malcolm looked up. "Why?" Minyi answered, "So you can stand on the right side of the law when I couldn't." Neither of them knew it then, but 20 years later, those words would come back in a courtroom where everything Minyi had built would be on the line. 20 years had passed since the night Minyi found a 10-year-old boy sleeping under a bridge, and Malcolm was no longer the frightened child who carried everything he owned in an old backpack. At 30 years old, Malcolm had become a successful criminal defense attorney, respected for the way he handled difficult cases, and more importantly, for the way he treated people who had nobody else standing beside them. He had graduated near the top of his class, built a strong reputation in court, and opened his own small law practice. He could have worked for a huge firm and made more money, but Malcolm remembered where his life had started. He often took cases for people who couldn't afford expensive lawyers because he knew what it felt like to be ignored. His father had taught him one lesson he never forgot: never decide a person's worth by where they started. Minyi was proud of him, but by then, the older man had begun stepping away from his old empire. He had handed most of his business operations to trusted managers and spent more time at home. For the first time in decades, his life seemed quiet. Malcolm and Minyi had become close in a way neither of them could have imagined when they first met. They argued about small things, laughed over dinner, and sometimes sat in silence without needing to say anything. Malcolm still called him Dad. Minyi still worried about him like he was 10 years old, but there was something both men understood without saying it. Malcolm had built a life far away from the world Minyi once controlled. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, everything changed. Malcolm was sitting in his office reviewing a case when his phone started ringing repeatedly. At first, he ignored it. Then his assistant rushed into the room with a look Malcolm had never seen before. "You need to turn on the news," she said. Malcolm reached for the remote. The screen showed police vehicles surrounding a large property. Then the headline appeared: Kang Min Jae arrested in major federal investigation. Malcolm froze. His father was being accused of organized crime, money laundering, murder, and several other serious charges. The news showed old photographs of Minyi and described him as one of the most dangerous criminal figures authorities had ever investigated. Malcolm felt the room closing around him. He knew his father's past wasn't clean, but he had never imagined it would come back like this. Then he heard the prosecutor speaking on television. "We have evidence that will put Kang Minyi behind bars for the rest of his life." Malcolm stared at the screen. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he stood up, grabbed his coat and walked toward the door. His assistant asked, "Where are you going?" Malcolm stopped and answered, "To see my father." He had spent 20 years becoming the lawyer Minyi wanted him to be. Now, for the first time, he wondered if that education had prepared him for the one case he never expected to take. By the time Malcolm reached the courthouse, the entire city was talking about his father. News helicopters circled above the building, reporters stood behind metal barriers, and cameras were pointed toward every black SUV that entered the parking lot. But Malcolm wasn't thinking about the headlines. He was thinking about the man who had once found him sleeping under a bridge. Then the courthouse doors opened, and Malcolm saw him. Minyi was being brought inside by federal agents with his hands cuffed behind his back. The sight hit Malcolm harder than he expected. His father looked older than he had the night before, his face tired and serious. Reporters shouted questions as he walked past. "Kang, did you order the killings? How much money did you move? Are you the head of the organization?" Minyi didn't answer. His eyes moved through the crowd until they found Malcolm. For a brief second, everything else seemed to disappear. Father and son simply looked at each other. Malcolm could see the message in his father's eyes: "Don't get involved." But Malcolm had already made his decision. He walked straight toward him. One of the agents tried to stop him, but Malcolm showed his attorney badge and said, "I'm his lawyer." Minyi shook his head. "Malcolm, go home." Malcolm stepped closer. "No, Dad, I'm not leaving you here." Minyi lowered his voice. "You don't understand what you're getting into." Malcolm looked at the handcuffs around his father's wrists. "I understand enough." Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out a case that looked almost impossible to beat. They accused Minyi of running a criminal organization for years, moving millions through shell companies, ordering violent attacks, and using legitimate businesses to hide illegal operations. They presented bank records, phone records, photographs, witness statements, and digital messages. The prosecutor spoke with confidence. "The evidence will show that Kang Minyi was the man behind it all." Malcolm listened without interrupting. He knew his father had a dark past. He wasn't there to pretend otherwise, but something about the case bothered him. The evidence seemed almost too perfect. Every document pointed in the same direction. Every witness told a story that made Minnie look guilty. Malcolm had learned in law school that real investigations were rarely that clean. After the hearing, he finally asked to speak with his father alone. Minnie sat across from him through the glass. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said. Malcolm leaned forward. "Maybe, but you taught me something when I was a kid." Minnie looked confused. Malcolm continued, "You told me to choose my own path. I chose the law, and right now the law says you deserve a defense." For the first time since his arrest, Minnie looked away. He knew his son was serious, but neither man knew that Malcolm's decision would soon uncover a secret buried inside Minnie's own empire and prove that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to put him behind bars. The next morning, Malcolm walked into his law office and made a decision that surprised everyone who worked with him. "I'm taking the case," he said. His assistant stared at him. "Your father," Malcolm nodded. She reminded him that the case was bigger than anything he had ever handled. Federal prosecutors were involved, the media was watching, and half the city already believed Minnie was guilty. Malcolm knew all of that. He also knew something else. His father deserved to have the evidence tested in court, not judged on television. By lunchtime, Malcolm had requested every piece of evidence the prosecution planned to use. He stayed at his desk for hours, reading bank statements, phone records, witness interviews, and hundreds of pages of reports. At first, everything seemed to support the government's case. Then Malcolm noticed something small. One of the financial records showed a transfer made at 9:42 p.m. on a particular night. According to the prosecution, Minnie had personally approved that transaction from a private office across town, but Malcolm checked another document. Minnie's security records showed that he had been at a charity dinner nearly 30 miles away at the exact same time. Malcolm frowned. One mistake could happen, but then he found another. A phone call the prosecution claimed came from Minnie's private number had actually been routed through a different device. Malcolm leaned back in his chair and stared at the documents. "Somebody changed this," he whispered. The deeper he went, the stranger the case became. Several witnesses had suddenly come forward within days of each other. Their statements used almost identical wording, even though they supposedly had no connection. One witness claimed Minnie had personally ordered an attack, but security footage showed Minnie entering a hotel hundreds of miles away that same evening. Malcolm called his father and asked him directly, "Did you order any of these attacks?" Minnie was silent for a long time. Then he answered no. Malcolm believed him, but he also knew belief wasn't enough. He needed proof. For the next several days, Malcolm barely slept. He tracked old employees, contacted former security staff, and compared records that investigators had apparently overlooked. Some people refused to speak, others were terrified. One former employee finally agreed to meet Malcolm in a quiet parking garage. The man looked nervous and kept checking over his shoulder. "Your father isn't the only person who knows how that empire works," he said. "There was someone inside who had access to everything." Malcolm asked who. The man shook his head. "I can't say that here." Then he handed Malcolm a small flash drive. "Look at the files yourself." Malcolm took it and drove straight back to his office. When he opened the first folder, his face went completely still. The evidence suggested that someone had been building a case against Minnie long before the arrest. And whoever was behind it had access to information that only a handful of people could have known. Malcolm sat alone in his office with the flash drive in his hand, unsure whether he was about to uncover the truth or make things even worse. He connected it to his computer and opened the first folder. Inside were copies of financial records, private messages, security logs, and audio files. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Malcolm noticed the dates. Several files had been created days before the events they were supposed to prove. He opened another document and found something even more troubling. A bank transfer that prosecutors said had been ordered by Minnie showed a timestamp that didn't match the bank's original record. Someone had edited it. Malcolm checked the original data stored on another system and found a completely different time. He leaned back in his chair and whispered, "They built this," but he needed more than a few mistakes. He needed proof that could survive in court. Malcolm spent the entire night comparing every piece of evidence. The more he checked, the worse it became. Phone records had been altered. Security footage had missing sections. Messages had been copied and changed before being handed to investigators. Then he found the biggest problem of all. One of the prosecution's main witnesses claimed he had met Minnie in a private warehouse on a certain night. He described the room, the conversation, even the clothes Minnie was wearing. But Malcolm checked the building's security system and discovered that the warehouse had been empty that night. Nobody had entered or left through the main doors. Malcolm tracked down the witness and confronted him with the records. The man's confidence disappeared. After several tense seconds, he finally admitted that someone had paid him to tell the story. "Who paid you?" Malcolm asked. The witness refused to answer. "You don't understand," he said. "If I tell you, they'll come after my family." That sentence told Malcolm everything he needed to know. Someone powerful was behind this. Someone who could threaten witnesses, manipulate records, and reach deep into Minyi's organization. Malcolm returned to the flash drive and opened one final folder. There was a list of payments made to several people connected to the investigation. At the bottom was a name Malcolm recognized immediately. It belonged to one of Minyi's most trusted senior managers, a man who had worked beside his father for more than 15 years. Malcolm stared at the screen in disbelief. The person helping destroy his father's life wasn't a stranger. He was someone Minyi trusted. Malcolm immediately called his father from the detention center. "Dad, there's something you need to know." Minyi's voice was calm. "What did you find?" Malcolm took a breath. "Someone inside your organization has been feeding false evidence to the investigators." There was silence on the other end. Then Minyi asked, "Who?" Malcolm looked at the name on his screen. "I'm not ready to say yet. But I think I know who built the entire case against you." For the first time, Minyi sounded afraid, not for himself but for Malcolm. "Son, stop digging." Malcolm shook his head even though his father couldn't see him. "I can't, Dad. You taught me never to walk away from the truth." And now Malcolm had one job left: take that truth into the courtroom. The courtroom was packed on the morning Malcolm finally presented the evidence he had uncovered. Reporters filled the back rows, federal agents stood along the walls, and Minyi sat quietly beside his lawyers, looking older than Malcolm had ever seen him. Everyone expected the prosecution to finish the case that day. Their witnesses had told powerful stories, the financial records looked convincing, and the media had already decided Minyi was guilty. But Malcolm walked to the front of the courtroom carrying a thin folder and a small flash drive. He looked toward the judge and said calmly, "Your Honor, the evidence presented against my client has been altered." A murmur moved through the room. The prosecutor immediately objected, calling Malcolm's claim desperate and unsupported. Malcolm didn't argue, he simply asked the court to examine the original records. One by one, the differences appeared on the screen. Bank records had been changed. Digital timestamps didn't match the original files. Phone records had been edited. Security footage had missing sections that were never explained. Then Malcolm called the prosecution's main witness back to the stand. The man looked nervous as Malcolm asked him to repeat his story. The witness claimed he had met Minyi at a warehouse on a certain night. Malcolm placed the warehouse security records in front of him. "You said you were inside this building with my client at 10:15 p.m., correct?" The witness nodded. Malcolm then showed the court footage proving the building had been empty that entire evening. The witness's face changed. "Someone told me what to say," he finally admitted. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge demanded to know who had paid him. The witness looked toward the prosecution table, then lowered his head. "I was paid through a company connected to Daniel Park," he said. Malcolm froze. Daniel Park was one of Minyi's most trusted senior managers. He had worked beside Minyi for more than 15 years. Malcolm then played the recording from the flash drive. In it, Park could be heard discussing payments to witnesses and talking about how Minyi's arrest would allow him to take control of the organization. The room went completely silent. Minyi stared at the screen, unable to believe the betrayal. Malcolm turned toward him for only a second before facing the judge again. "My client may have a complicated past," he said, "but that does not make manufactured evidence real." The prosecution's case began falling apart piece by piece. Federal investigators immediately moved to question Park, while several other people connected to the scheme were taken into custody. After hours of arguments, the judge ruled that the key evidence had been compromised and ordered the major charges against Minyi dismissed pending further investigation. Minyi was finally released from custody. Outside the courthouse, cameras surrounded Malcolm and his father. A reporter shouted, "Why would you risk your career to defend him?" Malcolm looked at Minyi and quietly answered, "Because 20 years ago he didn't ask what I was worth, he just saved me." And for the first time in 20 years, Minyi looked at his son with tears in his eyes. Outside the courthouse, the cameras slowly disappeared. The reporters moved on to their next story, and the crowd began to thin out. For the first time in days, Minyi was free. But instead of celebrating, he stood quietly beside Malcolm, staring at the courthouse steps. He looked tired, not like the powerful man everyone once feared, but like a father who had just realized how close he came to losing everything. Malcolm walked over and asked, "You okay, Dad?" Minnie looked at him and smiled. I am now. They drove home without saying much. That evening they sat at the same dinner table where Malcolm had once asked if he could call him Dad. 20 years had passed, but the memory still felt close. Minnie looked across the table and said, I spent my whole life building an empire because I thought power would keep me safe. Malcolm listened quietly, but the only thing that saved me was the boy I found under a bridge. Malcolm smiled. You didn't save me so I could become your protector. You saved me so I could become myself. Those words hit Minnie harder than Malcolm expected. Over the next few months, Minnie began shutting down the last parts of his criminal operation. He sold businesses, ended old relationships, and walked away from the life that had nearly destroyed him. He couldn't change the past, but he could decide what came next. Malcolm continued practicing law, but his father's case changed the way he saw his work. He started helping people who had been forgotten, people who had been judged because they were poor, homeless, or simply didn't have anyone powerful standing beside them. One weekend, Malcolm asked his father to drive with him across the city. Minnie had no idea where they were going until they stopped beneath an old bridge. Malcolm stepped out of the car and looked at the concrete wall where he had once slept. This is where you found me, he said. Minnie stood beside him and remembered that rainy night. Malcolm then told him something he had been thinking about for years. I want to help kids like me. Together, they created a small foundation that provided meals, temporary housing, school supplies, and legal support for homeless children and families. Minnie funded it, but Malcolm ran it. He wanted every child who walked through those doors to hear the words he once needed to hear. You still have a future. Years later, Malcolm would often tell people that his father saved his life once. But what Minnie never expected was that Malcolm would save his life too, not by fighting criminals or using violence, but by standing beside him when everyone else had already judged him. The world saw a former mafia boss and a successful lawyer. They saw a complicated past and a powerful present, but Malcolm saw something much simpler. He saw the man who stopped one rainy night and chose not to drive away. And Minnie saw the homeless little boy he once rescued, who had grown into the man who came back when he needed him most. Because sometimes family isn't about blood. Sometimes it's about the person who stays when everyone else walks away.